In our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon, July 12th, an alarming resurgence in COVID-19 here in South Korea with more than 37,000 cases announced today. Authorities are set to share new guidelines on Wednesday. In its report to the top office, the Finance Ministry pledged to place priority on curbing the cost of living. Also on this Tuesday, the Ministries of Trade and Startups are making their reports. The natural gas pipeline that carries Russian gas to Germany has been closed for scheduled maintenance, but Europe is bracing for an extended closure amid its standoff with Moscow over Ukraine. There has been a frightening rebound in daily COVID-19 cases here in South Korea on this Tuesday, with authorities announcing well over 37,000 new infections. Now, accordingly, a recently launched advisory committee held its first meeting back on Monday to hammer out science-based containment measures, with the government poised to share a broad framework of such efforts tomorrow. That would be Wednesday. Our Kim Bo-kyung starts us off.
South Korea saw the highest number of new cases in almost 2 months, as it reported 37,360 new COVID-19 cases on Tuesday. The number is more than twice the figure for the same day last week and almost 4 times more than 2 weeks before, clearly indicating a doubling of cases. Health authorities are on alert as a similar pattern of doubling was seen in the Omicron wave last January. One expert says such an uptick will continue, hitting its peak next month.
The numbers of new cases and hospitalized patients are on the rise, and they are expected to become significantly greater in a couple more weeks to come. Based on the previous resurgent experiences, we will see another peak hitting probably in next month.
To tackle the uptick, South Korea launched a new expert committee for infectious disease on Monday. The team of experts held their first meeting and pledged to devise science-based prevention measures. While the experts discussed ways to better respond to the resurgence of the virus in the summer, they emphasized the need to focus on minimizing the number of deaths and to protect those at high risk by strengthening the nation's medical system.
Whatever kind of pandemic wave comes, it is our goal to focus on lowering fatality and severity rates and making people feel safe about COVID-19, rather than its scale itself.
Experts have discussed whether to expand the fourth vaccination rollout, which currently is only for over 60s and people with impaired immunity, and also whether to keep the preventive measures such as the 7-day mandatory quarantine in place or bring back social distancing measures. Based on the experts' view discussed during the meeting on Monday, health authorities are set to make an announcement on preventive measures this Wednesday. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
In related news, the resurgence in COVID-19 infections is evident across the globe, and further aggravating concerns is the spread of a new variant over in India. Our Kim Hyo-sun reports.
As COVID-19 plagues countries throughout the world, the Asian gambling center Macau is no exception. Local authorities on Monday decided to shut all the city's casinos for the first time in over 2 years, as around 1,500 people have tested positive for COVID-19 in the past 3 weeks. Over 30 casinos, as well as other non-essential businesses, were shut for 1 week, while residents were ordered to stay at home, aside from making short trips for essential services. The world continues to witness growing numbers of COVID-19 cases amid the recent emergence of the new Omicron BA.5 variant. The BA.5 variant has already been identified across 83 countries. The variant has now also become the most dominant strain in the U.S., leading to more people contracting the virus multiple times in relatively quick succession. The WHO has issued a warning over a subvariant that is known to have a stronger transmission power.
In Europe and America, BA4 and BA5 are driving waves. In countries like India, a new sublineage of BA2.75 has also been detected, which we're following.
Scientists say the latest variant may be able to spread rapidly and get around immunity from vaccines and previous infection. The strain has been spotted in several distant states across India and appears to be spreading faster than other variants there. It's also been detected in about 10 other countries, including Australia, Germany, and Canada. Amid the latest resurgence, experts say vaccines and booster shots are the best defense against severe COVID-19. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
In other news, the Ministry of Economy and Finance has kicked off the presidential briefing sessions. The ministry was the first to make its report to President Yoon, during which it vowed to rein in the cost of living. Our Om Ji-young covers that session.
South Korean government ministries have begun making reports to the president this week, with the first to go on Monday being the Ministry of Economy and Finance. The report was delivered at the Yongsan presidential office, and unlike in the past, the president's session with Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho was kept small for the sake of efficiency. The vice minister said the agenda covered major projects now underway.
This time we have selected projects that we're working on in 7 key areas and will report their progress and future plans.
With inflation soaring, the top priority is stabilizing people's livelihoods. The Finance Ministry will put together a task force to closely monitor and stabilize consumer prices and will come up with measures next month ahead of a national holiday, Chuseok, which comes in September. Another big pillar covers economic issues at home and abroad. The ministry plans to strengthen supply chains in key industries, including semiconductors and shipbuilding. Also, it'll preemptively deal with risks in the real estate and financial markets and long-term issues, including the shrinking population and carbon neutrality. Under the Yoon administration's private-led economy policy, the ministry has set up a private-public task force tasked with finding unnecessary regulations to eliminate and plans to announce measures within this month. And as the national debt hits record highs, the ministry reported its major fiscal reform plan, the details of which will be announced in September. Other major topics are restructuring government spending to further support key projects and reforming public institutions to enhance efficiency and provide quality services to the public. Also, there'll be major reforms to the tax system focused on revitalizing people's livelihoods, which will be announced next week. President Yoon told Finance Minister that measures should be in place to ease the tax burden on public who are suffering due to surging inflation. Also, he added that preemptive measures are needed to stabilize prices during the national Chuseok holiday. The next to give their reports on Tuesday will be the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy and the Ministry of SMEs and Startups. Om Ji-young, Arirang News.
On the defense front, come August, Seoul and Washington will launch their joint military drills, which had been scaled back in recent years amid a number of factors. Our Peun-ji has more.
South Korea's military will be conducting virtual military exercises with the U.S. from August 22nd to September 1st. But an informed military source reportedly said Monday that the two countries are considering whether to include live field training and that this will be decided after reviewing different types of situations. The biannual joint military exercise is held every spring and summer, but had been scaled back in recent years. First in 2018 as part of efforts to denuclearize North Korea, after then-President Donald Trump held a summit with the North leader Kim Jong-un in Singapore. And it wasn't able to go back to the same scale as before because of the pandemic. So for the past few years, only virtual training called CCPT, or computer-simulated command post exercise, has been held, using minimal personnel. Meanwhile, the upcoming joint training comes at a time when North Korea has also begun its summertime military drill. After heavy rain, some of the North's military units are also reportedly working on repairing damage from flooding.
Starting July, the North Korean military appears to be conducting its summertime military exercise. But we assess part of this has been affected by COVID-19 and heavy rain in the area, and we are closely monitoring the situation.
Amid rising tensions on the Korean peninsula after Pyongyang was seen almost ready for its first nuclear test in 5 years and growing missile threats, Seoul is trying to bolster its joint defense readiness with Washington. Peun-ji, Arirang News.
On the international front, the natural gas pipeline that carries Russian gas to Germany has been closed for scheduled maintenance. But Europe itself is bracing for a possible extended closure amid its standoff with Moscow over the former's invasion of Ukraine. Our Lee Seung-jae explains.
According to operator Nord Stream AG on Monday, maintenance on Nord Stream 1, the largest single pipeline carrying Russian gas to Germany, has begun, halting the flow of the resource for the next 10 days. On the same day, Russia's gas giant Gazprom notified Italy that it would be reducing the amount of gas supplied to the country from 32 million cubic meters of gas per day to 21 million. The European continent, which relies heavily on Russian gas, is now on edge as it fears Russia could extend scheduled maintenance to restrict the European gas supply further. This means plans to fill gas storage facilities ahead of winter will be in disarray, while the situation could heighten a gas crisis that has prompted emergency measures from governments and painfully high bills for consumers. The latest halt in Russian gas has also prompted some countries to brace for the worst and seek alternatives to ease reliance on Russia.
Let's prepare for a total cut-off of Russian gas. That remains the most likely scenario. This requires us to accelerate our energy independence, to accelerate filling up our stocks, to build a floating LNG plant in Le Havre quickly, and to make ourselves stop spending 2 or 3 years doing something that other nations do in 6 months.
Despite the geopolitical situation in the region, Russia dismissed claims they are using oil and gas to exert political pressure, saying the maintenance shutdown was a regular, scheduled event, adding that no one was inventing the need for any repairs. Russia has also cut off gas supplies to several European countries that didn't comply with a request by Moscow for all energy payments to be made in rubles. Since June, Gazprom has cut gas flows through Nord Stream 1 to just 40% of the pipeline's capacity, but cited a delay in the return of equipment being serviced by Germany's Siemens Energy. Watchers say despite calls for less dependence on Russian gas, a sudden cut in supply would mean dark days to come for many European countries, leaving some to believe the worst is yet to come, with the winter season mere months away. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, regional production of rice is being threatened amid soaring prices of fertilizer and growing global demand. Our Yoon reports.
After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the global food supply has been hit with a surge in prices for wheat and corn. The prices of rice has managed to hold out against the instability so far, but that may not last much longer as fertilizer prices continue to hit record highs. Experts cite panic over supplies in 2008 when rice soared above $1,000 a ton, which is more than double the current level. Most of the world's rice is grown and eaten in Asia. Thailand is the world's second largest rice exporter. Farmers not only have to cope with erratic weather due to climate change, but have now reached a critical point as higher fertilizer prices have led to decreased nutrients for crops, which in turn have cut yields, resulting in a failure to meet global demand.
The major problem of the war of Ukraine for us is the relationship between energy prices and fertilizer prices. So what we are observing is that the prices of gas has gone up. That has increased the cost of producing fertilizers, specifically nitrogen, which Russia Federation is the first exporter of nitrogen in the world, the second of potassium, and the third of phosphorus.
While India is expected to play a role in helping to ease tightened rice supply in Asia for the time being, there's further concern that the Ukraine war may jeopardize food security in Africa. Even prior to the invasion, Africa had a high reliance on international food markets for their food supply, with a fifth of its population already suffering from hunger. But as more countries are impacted by food price inflation, the global ripple effect could ultimately lead to the destabilization of African governments. Yoon, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of part 1 of the Daily Report. We return with part 2 in a few minutes. Stay with us.
South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduced a Korean New Year. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis, a pledge to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
Welcome back. On Viewpoint today, we compare corporate cultures across the globe. And for that purpose, I have a panel of journalists with me here in the studio as well as online. I have Arirang here in the studio. Arirang, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
I also have Hui-Ling Tan live on the line over in Singapore. Hui-Ling, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
We'll start here in the studio then. Arirang, let's start with a few words on what you find to be most intriguing about Korea's corporate culture.
Well, what kind of got me onto reporting an article on this topic was that I found that it's kind of evident that there is slow change happening in the workplace culture. So I interviewed, young tech workers, young CEOs, and yeah, they were telling me that, they're unhappy with all the hierarchy, workplace abuse, being stepped on by older coworkers, not having their ideas respected and listened to. Just being told what to do all the time, not being able to express themselves. And, you have women reporting harassment as well, lookism, all these kinds of things. And it seems like these kind of issues are rising more and more. More people are talking about it. So it was really interesting for me to look into that. And we even have big companies like SK, using English name now to have less of a hierarchical interaction. But also what's tricky is it's hard to gauge what is real progress because, some companies look really progressive and, maybe they have like a Western style, but then when you actually work, there's just the same old thing. But still, I do think things are happening and, that's really interesting.
Right, so efforts are being made to kind of ensure a horizontal working environment.
Yeah, that's like the new big word. Everybody wants to be horizontal, but some actually are and some are just acting like they are. So, yeah.
Right. Hui-Ling, what do you believe to be most striking about the work environment here in South Korea?
So what often strikes me when I read about South Korean work culture is this phenomenon of, rather regular after-work gathering with your colleagues for the purposes of maybe team building, socializing, or entertaining. And like Arirang says, this has probably changed during the pandemic for obvious reasons, and also because at newer companies and startups where things are a little bit more horizontal and maybe where people respect work-life balance a little bit more, but by and large, it's what we associate with a more traditional Korean workplace culture. That's not really a thing here in Singapore. So sometimes we catch a beer with our colleagues after work at the local pub, but that's about it. We don't really have a sort of a corporate ritual in Korea where we go out after work as a team for team building or bonding. It stops at a very casual beer after work. And when we do have team dinners or drinks, it's usually for quite a specific purpose, like end of year drinks or if somebody is visiting, leaving, or joining a team. So that's pretty intriguing to me, this culture of gathering with your colleagues after work to socialize, because South Koreans, I think, are already known for working really long hours. So you would be spending even more time with your colleagues and arguably at work.
Right. And Erin, lunch also here involves groups of co-workers heading to the cafeteria or to restaurants located near their office. What are your thoughts on this communal dining, so to speak?
Right. So, I mean, the people I've interviewed and spoken to for this report, I mean, many of them really enjoy this. I mean, there isn't anything inherently wrong with having a meal, having some alcohol with your co-workers, but for them, the problem becomes when there's an obligation and an expectation to come out and stay out until 3, 4, 5 a.m. and then report back to work at 9 a.m. That's when, you know, work life impedes on your private life, and your private sphere becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. I think Reuters reported that so many people were happy now during the last 2 years of not having to go to these things, and they could spend their time going to the gym or having new hobbies. And for me, what especially struck me is that, you know, even, you know, old school rigid companies, I mean, I don't know how many, I mean, it's not a lot, but some, I think, you know, they still take their coworkers to like hostess bars and that kind of thing. And I spoke to a young tech worker who was like, yeah, I mean, I have to go to these things. If I don't go, I'm gonna not have my job anymore. So yeah, these are the kind of viewpoints I've heard.
Right, of course, but times are changing, of course, and there are efforts to make that less of a trend, though. And the pandemic also has played its part, because not a lot of people are able to work in the office, they take up remote working. And that being said, of course, then, Huling, what is the lunch culture like within the work environment in Singapore?
So I was just saying that isn't really like in South Korea a ritualized after work dinner and drinks culture, but there is definitely a lunch culture here in Singapore at the workplace where staff would go out for lunch in groups as well. I think it's because culturally we do enjoy communal dining in Singapore, and also people take this time to socialize with their colleagues. So often they would be talking about their family life over lunch, their children, the property market, their children's education. And I guess it's pretty similar to South Korea. But, and I remember there was a conversation online about this a few years ago. Singapore is a regional hub for many offices. So in some companies, there are sizable numbers of foreigners and local staff. And some people noticed that foreign staff would prefer to eat on their own, while locals would go out in groups to eat. So I suppose that there's a cultural differences as well. But I would say that the communal dining culture here in Singapore probably stops at lunch and maybe at tea time. It doesn't really extend into the evening. Nobody's obligated to go socialize with their colleagues after work. I have to say alcohol is really expensive here in Singapore as well, so maybe that's why.
Right, I see. Arian, beyond Korea, labor laws in France prohibit the eating of meals at one's office desk. Now, here in South Korea, it's a common sight to have people dining at their desk because of lack of time, work perhaps. What are your thoughts on this practice of dining at one's desk?
Yeah, I mean, I read about this new law they have in France, and their reasoning is that they think it's really important to have this 1.5-hour lunch break, and that it is important to not, you know, I mean, research shows that working 10, 11, 12, 13 hours doesn't lead to bigger outcomes in your output, you know? And I think they're right about that, but we still see a lot of people think that, oh, I need to have more hours. But you know, some of the people I've spoken to, like, you know, people in startups and so on, they say, you know, they want to work smarter, not harder. And they don't necessarily, it's not working out for them anymore to have to stay at their table until the oldest person has left, you know. Yeah, so I think working hours and how we relate to them plays a big role in the working space as well.
Right, and personally speaking, do you spend time eating at your desk, or are you able to have a proper lunch time outside of your work area?
No, yeah, of course. I have proper lunch time. I mean, I think you need that time to, rethink, because even when you're not sitting at your table, I mean, the thing is, are you sitting at your table so other people can see you're working, or they think you're working, or are you doing it for yourself? Right. I think that's what's really important, that some companies have this culture where you look like you're working all the time, even though you're not even doing anything.
Right, I see. Hui-Ling, there's a new word on the block here in South Korea. It's called lunchflation, which refers to the growing number of white-collar office workers choosing to head to convenience stores for affordable lunch options. How is inflation perhaps affecting lunch menus among office workers there in Singapore?
Inflation is a huge issue in Singapore as well, like in many parts of the world, and food prices in general across the board has gone up. May food inflation was up 4.5% year on year, I believe, slightly lower than in South Korea, which was 5.4%. But I would say in the CBD, I haven't seen anyone dashing into convenience stores to eat instant food for lunch. I haven't read much about it. In Singapore, we do have a range of options, even in the CBD, from hawker centers, which are like food court, all the way up to high-end restaurants. So there are options for workers for almost every budget. And also, I think in the CBD, what we've been hearing is that for many of the eateries, they are under pressure not to hike prices up too much, because footfall is still lower compared to the pandemic, particularly since many of these places are also tourist hotspots. So footfall is down compared to pre-pandemic, and prices have gone up. I think at most places. I notice my office is in a CBD, so I can see, what I spent for lunch going up, but maybe it's not as bad as in South Korea.
Right. And beyond lunch and staying with the pandemic that Hui-Ling has just mentioned, Arian, some are calling for a blend of remote and in-person working arrangements as they underscore the cost, actually, of commuting to and from work itself. Now, that being said, what do you believe are the merits and perhaps demerits of these two working options?
Right. I mean, we have seen big companies like, here, more and more going remote. And experts think that this kind of move might create less of a hierarchy in the workplace, because, when somebody isn't always there looking at what you're doing, looking over your shoulder, can't talk about, what you're wearing and that kind of stuff, that might lead to people being more free. And I think if it can give workers more flexibility, that's really good. And, I think if you're home, you can't be obliged to go to an after work as well, maybe. So yeah, but of course, nowadays there's like spy applications, so even if you're home, they still can check what you're doing all the time. So I think there is a right way and a wrong way to do it.
Right, there really is. Hui-Ling, is remote working still a valid option in corporate Singapore? I mean, what is the overall public perception with regard to this form of working that gained popularity amid the pandemic?
So I think remote work is here to stay, for now at least. In Singapore, the civil service is the biggest employer, and recently the civil service has announced that they will let employees work on average 2 out of 5 days a week at home. And I think employees generally welcome hybrid work because they have found during the pandemic that it is beneficial to working. Many of the, especially caregivers, they enjoy, they don't enjoy, flexible work is useful for them. And also people don't have to spend time during the commute anymore. And often this is not at the expense of productivity. So hybrid work is popular among workers here. A recent survey, I think, also found that over 70% of employees would like hybrid work as part of their, job scope. Of course, it also depends on your job scope and your company, and sometimes your managers. Some managers may want more face time in the office, but right now in Singapore, there is a labor crunch. I think unemployment is around 2%. So employers are under some pressure as well to offer hybrid and remote work as a feature.
Right, and staying with what you just mentioned, Hui Ling, is a labor shortage, Hui Ling, a problem there in Singapore as it is here in South Korea and in quite a number of countries across the globe?
Yes, we hear from employers, particularly in certain sectors, that they are unable to find employees with their required skill sets. This is, from what I understand, a problem particularly in tech industries where you need very specific skill sets like AI. And Singapore is also tightening the requirements for acquiring work permits and work passes for foreign staff here. So there is a sort of a labor crunch in certain sectors in the markets here because very specific skill sets are required for some of them. And Singapore is a regional hub for many companies. So that's why they need this stuff.
Right, of course. Arian, moving further, I understand quite a number of European countries, including Denmark and Sweden, of course, have efficient work environments. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't want to come here and be like, oh, we're so good and all countries should do it the way where I'm from are doing it. But I think we can see that, you know, in like Scandinavian countries, they work less. Maybe they go home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but they still have the same output and I think they rank the highest in terms of number of hours worked and and the things they get done. Because there is a lot of laws. I mean, you can't just make workers work overtime. If you do, you have to pay a lot more. And I think workers are much more aware of that. You know, when somebody asks you to do something, you don't have to say yes. You can just be like, oh, this is not legal or this is not cool. So I think there is a lot of that, but I think it's hard to compare and export certain cultures to others. You know, we saw, for example, in the startup scene here, like 10 years ago, people were looking at the States. Oh, we have to be like some tech companies over there, but it's really hard to import culture. And I think each place has its own history, its own language that has the reasons for why things are the way they are.
Right, it really is. Hui Ling, generally speaking, what can be done, do you suppose, to perhaps ensure a healthy balance between professional work and private lives?
That's a really good question, given that Singapore, alongside South Korea, I think rank really high when it comes to these global surveys on stress levels. So I think recently there was a survey that found that 85% of Singapore workers are at risk of burnout. And I think with this rise in hybrid work, this risk is also heightened to a certain degree because the boundaries between work and home are blurred. So the responsibility is on both the employer and the employees to better demarcate these boundaries as well. For managers, I think it would help if they can just take time to tell their staff not to stay too late at work if their work is done, or to not contact them during their time off if it's not urgent. And our employees as well should be cognizant that they need to take time out when they are not at work instead of being plugged in all the time. Of course, there are other things like paid maternity, paternity, and family care leave that would really help that would help. But I think at the end of the day, everybody has to realize, that it's not going to help anyone's cause to have a burnt out workforce, and that we do need to take time off to rest and recharge. So during your times off, just unplug if you have to.
Right, and stay with the same question. Arian, what are your thoughts on ensuring a balance between our professional work and our private lives?
Well, I think that I think you have to look at the expectations that companies have and people have for themselves. I think we live in a time where we are urged to work more and more and more, and there is an economy that also urges us to work more and more. So I think for things to change, people, the way we talk about work, I think nowadays often work is inherently seen as good. The more I work, the better. But if we have another way of seeing our life that is not so zoned in on work, then that is one thing. But then another thing is labor laws, regulations, so that when your boss comes and tells you to do this or that, you can say, oh, this is not, it's not legal. So yeah, I think it's an issue of attitudes and the kind of cultural elements of the way we see how our life should be structured, and also a legal element and an economic element as well, so that you don't maybe have to work so much to make the same money,
And perhaps the fact that we're having this conversation itself is perhaps a step in the right direction then.
I hope so.
Right, Arirang, thank you so much for your time. And Philling over in Singapore, that is, thank you very much for your insight today. The early onset of scorching summer is a phenomenon currently being shared by countries in the northern hemisphere, including South Korea. Our Kim Jung-sil has more on the alarming mercury levels.
0.32 degrees. That's how much warmer our planet was this June compared to the average over the previous 30 years. Doesn't seem like much? Well, it's actually the third hottest June since 1991, and the only Junes hotter than that were just in the past few years. Also using 30 years of data, Europe's Copernicus Climate Change Service said Monday that this June was also the third hottest for the world as a whole. For Europe, it was the second hottest at about 1.6 degrees above average. Daily highs in Spain, France, and Italy surpassed 40 degrees, and the heat worsened the ongoing drought in the region of Italy's Po River. In Norway, the extreme northern villages of Tana Bru and Banak reached 32.5 degrees last week, the hottest June day ever recorded in the Arctic Circle. In South Korea, the average temperature last month was 1 degree higher than the June average going back to 1973, when data were first compiled. At 22.4 degrees, it was the third hottest June on record. The average in late June rose to an all-time high at 25.7 degrees. It was also the first time June has seen a so-called tropical night, meaning when it doesn't get below 25 degrees. That happened in Seoul, Suwon, and 13 other regions. Experts say the heat dome phenomenon that's happened for the past few years could happen again this year. Heat domes form when high pressure from Tibet, where it's dry, meets high pressure from the wet North Pacific, which keeps the hot weather trapped. Experts warn the extreme heat in Korea has only just begun. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
On the local front, starting today, that is Tuesday, drivers in South Korea have new traffic regulations to abide by, aimed at protecting pedestrians at crosswalks. My colleague Choi Min-jung was out and about.
Police officers are out on the streets, making people aware of new traffic rules. The new regulations come into place from Tuesday to better protect pedestrians. One of the biggest changes is at intersections. All vehicles now must stop completely before making a turn to the right when there are pedestrians crossing the crosswalk. When the traffic light ahead is red, drivers must stop even just for a brief moment. They may then slowly turn right if there are no pedestrians crossing the crosswalk. And if there is an accident, drivers will be held responsible for driving while the traffic light is on red. What if the traffic light ahead is green? If there are no pedestrians on the crosswalk, drivers will not be required to stop and they may turn right at a slow speed. However, if there are pedestrians, again, drivers must stop.
Simply put, when there are pedestrians crossing or even getting ready to cross the crosswalk, all vehicles must stop completely until the wheels don't move. Drivers who do not comply by the rules have to pay 60,000 won, or around $46.
Another major change has been made in school zones. When driving in child protection zones near schools, vehicles must stop at crosswalks even if there are no traffic lights.
Drivers must also come to a complete stop, even if there's nobody at the crosswalk.
It's not about enforcing stricter laws, but more about raising awareness. Many countries, such as those in Europe, already have a driving culture focused on pedestrians. With the newly imposed rules, South Korea can also shift its focus away from drivers and more toward pedestrians.
Last year in South Korea, 1 in 3 car accident deaths involved pedestrians. This is more than 50% higher than the OECD average. As the figure suggests, there is still much to be done to keep pedestrians safe, but these new regulations could be a step in the right direction. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Seoul City is working to bridge the digital divide between the tech-savvy and the tech-challenged, if you will. As part of such efforts, officials here are working to set up unmanned kiosks that better cater to vulnerable groups. Our Song Yoo-jin shows us how.
These days, you can easily buy food, drinks, and movie tickets without having to speak to another person. This is all thanks to unmanned kiosks. But for some groups, such as seniors and the disabled, these kiosks can be more of a burden. The small letters on the screen are hard to read, and a wrong touch could mean starting all over again. This can be stressful, especially if other people are waiting. And it can even make them feel more socially isolated.
It takes a lot of time for you to place an order if you're not used to using kiosks. This puts you in a tough spot, especially when there are people lined up behind you. Some people just give up in the end.
And to help these groups out, Seoul City is taking action. The city government, in cooperation with private companies and disability organizations, is developing a kiosk that's easy for seniors and the disabled to use. It'll be ready for use by the end of this year. The city has also appointed 100 digital guides who will show people how to use kiosks and smartphones. They will go into action from July 25th after 2 weeks of training. Seoul City is also going to run a campaign that encourages people to understand and wait for those who are unfamiliar with kiosks. And to help more citizens become better at using kiosks, a one-day training program where trainees learn the instructions and apply what they've learned will start from July. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
On a light note now, the National Palace Museum of Korea has on display a number of priceless pieces of Korean history that were recently recovered. My colleague Kim Hyun-sung was there.
Years of colonization, wars, invasions, and looting have left holes in the country's treasure trove. Valuable cultural artifacts ended up missing or stranded overseas. But about 40 cultural artifacts have been safely returned home. They're on show here at the National Palace Museum of Korea. Some are on display to the public for the first time in history. Like this box with inlaid mother-of-pearl, plum, bird, and bamboo design, and this book of calligraphy by Joseon kings, both from the late Joseon dynasty. Exhibition opened on the 7th of this month through the help of Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation, and it will run until September 25th.
This exhibition highlights the efforts to bring back our cultural heritage that were overseas. Through this exhibition, we wanted many people to think about what we should do to protect our heritage overseas.
We've calculated the distance our employees have traveled to retrieve these artifacts over the past 10 years. The sheer distance added up would be the same as about 160 times around the Earth. We have infinite responsibility to bring back what's our symbolic cultural heritage.
Every artifact here tells its own story. Some were lost during a war. Some came back through donation or an auction. These seals were brought home through joint efforts led by South Korea and the U.S., who worked together to track down and bring them back home. But there's still much to recover.
About 210,000 cultural properties are still overseas. A lot of cultural artifacts are wilting away because we don't know where they are or because places that have them can't take proper care of them.
As for now, there is no international law that guarantees the safe return of cultural heritages, even ones that have been illegally taken, making these cultural treasures way back home long and winding. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the UK, it's been revealed when we can expect to know who is the next Prime Minister. The date looks set for September 5th. That's when we'll know the final result of the ballot when Conservative Party members pick between the final two candidates. So far, 11 Conservative MPs have officially put their names forward for the post. All hopeful candidates need at least 20 nominations from among the party's 358 lawmakers. A series of votes by lawmakers will then reduce that number to 2 final candidates. Finally, a postal ballot of the Conservative Party's 200,000 members will take place in the summer to choose the winner. The contest to replace Boris Johnson comes after lawmakers forced the Prime Minister to step down following a series of scandals. India is set to become the most populous country in the world by 2023, overtaking China's 1.4 billion people. This is according to a UN report released to mark World Population Day. Despite the slowest rate of global population growth since 1950, the world's population could peak at 10.4 billion people by the 2080s. However, population expansion is uneven, as more than half the growth will happen in just 8 countries, including the Philippines, Ethiopia, India, and Nigeria. Meanwhile, the EU's population is seeing a decline on the back of COVID-19. According to figures from Eurostat on Monday, the number of people across the 27 member countries fell by roughly 172,000 in 2021, following a drop of 656,000 the previous year. This comes as the region saw over 2 million COVID-19 related deaths. Former Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone is being charged with fraud and false representation. This follows an overseas assets investigation by the UK's Revenue and Customs Department. Now, the 91-year-old faces charges of failing to declare his assets after allegedly hiding assets worth over $475 million. Ecclestone ran Formula One for 40 years before being ousted in 2017. His time there saw Ecclestone build up a fortune amounting to an estimated $2.9 billion. The first images from the largest space telescope ever built are set to finally be released. After its launch into space on December 25, 2021, the James Webb Telescope's first images will be broadcast live on NASA TV and YouTube at 10:30 a.m. Tuesday, Eastern Standard Time. This comes after U.S. President Joe Biden unveiled a single deep field picture of space called Webb's First Deep Field during a preview at the White House. The image is the deepest and highest resolution infrared view ever taken of the universe. Future images from the telescope promise a look at stars and galaxies that emerged in the aftermath of the Big Bang. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Tuesday afternoon. We may not like the combination of high temperatures and high humidity pushing the heat to an uncomfortable level, but that's what we have to get used to. Hot and muggy weather continues mostly in western regions, with Seoul reaching 31 degrees. And we do have rain in the forecast. Precipitation will vary, 5 millimeters in coastal areas of Gangwon province and up to 40 millimeters on Jeju Island. So keep your rain gear handy if you live in those areas. And now that the rain has subsided, scorching heat is gripping the country, reaching 30 or 31 degrees. Also, heat advisories have been newly issued for parts of Jeollanam-do province and Jeju Island. So please make sure to rest in a cool place after outdoor activities. And monsoon rain will kick in again tomorrow from early in the morning, bringing heavy downpours of up to 120 millimeters, which could damage property. So always monitor weather alerts to keep yourself up to date on the situation. Now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
And that ends this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back with more coverage same time on Wednesday. See you then.